I'm a little wary to introduce our guest speaker because I'm not sure whether it was a fake or whether it was the real Churchill or told somehow get to see us. But I'm told he's very good at what he's going to do for us. So first of all, we welcome.
He is award-winning architect, artist, sculptor, writer, actor, playwright, and now well known as he has lectured in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, Singapore, Hong Kong. And the topic is Winston Churchill, wanted dead or alive, reward £25. With that, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What a wonderful crowd. Hey, you're going to love this talk. Wowee. Churchill was well known. Everybody knew him. He came from a noble family. He was a soldier. He was a writer. He was everything, and the debate went on about him being captured. Was he going to be shot? No, they didn't think so. But let's start the story at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning. He landed in Cape Town on the 30th of October, 1899, on the Donata Castle with Buller. Buller had arrived with him. And he renewed his friendship. He was scarcely in Cape Town for a day, and he dashed off 200 words to his paper and took the train to Natal. You can't do it today, but then he did. He took a train to Natal. His biggest worry was that he was going to miss all the fun. So he came armed with letters from Chamberlain to people like Sir Alfred Milner, contact with Rhodes, Eckstein, Byte, and that didn't stop him from jumping on a train with his valet and enough equipment for a very small little army. And he landed in Escort. Got to Durban before Buller, but he dashed off to the front. And he got only as far as Escort, where his valet, when you go to the army, you've got to bring a valet. His valet had put up his bell tent up in the train yard. And he was desperate to get up to Ladysmith, which is only 40 miles up the track. He wanted to tie up with his friend who was stationed there, and we're going to talk about him now. And while he was kicking his heels in Escort, he wrote to his paper, and this is what he said: "I think it very sporting of the Boers to take on the whole British Empire. Let us learn our lessons. Always remember, however easy you may think that you can win, that there would be no war if the other fellow didn't think he had a chance." So sitting around didn't suit Churchill. He wanted to join up with Melton Prior. Melton Prior was this incredible artist guy who would draw pictures of the battle, and he'd send them through, and he managed to sneak his dispatches through. And Churchill wanted to get up to be with him, but he couldn't. He then decided that he would try and bribe a guide to send him through to up to Ladysmith, and that also didn't work out. And so he got himself a ride on an armored train with Captain Helmsley. It was a reconnaissance mission up to Colenso. And so they left early in the morning, and on his return, he wrote a 600-word letter to Adjutant General Sir Elvin Wood, stating that a long and bloody war is before us, and the end is by no means certain as people imagine. He was quite happy to criticize the war and the generals, which didn't make him very popular with Whitehall or the local generals. He then accepted another invitation from his old chum at arms from the Tyra expedition in India, one Captain Alma Haldane, and to join him on a further and a bigger reconnaissance train. And the train was to set out early on the morning of the 15th of November, 1899. And this was a much more substantial reconnaissance. There were 117 men and 3 officers, and they set off at 5:30 in the morning. And at that time, the English were experimenting with armored trains. And this one, and one of the trains, they even wrapped up in ropes, and it looks like a giant Yorkshire Terrier. This one they called Hairy Mary. And so one day they went, but our one was now lined with loopholes. So they set off early in the morning. This one was lined with loopholes. Churchill commented that nothing looks more formidable than an armored train, but nothing is in fact more vulnerable or helpless. So they set off at 5:30, and they arrived at Frere Station about an hour later. And they met a branch of the Natal police who said that they hadn't seen any Boers. So he dashed off a telegram to Colonel Long, who was in charge of the reconnaissance, to tell him that there were no Boers, and immediately set off towards Ladysmith, which was a problem because Colonel Long had just received a letter to say that Boers were spotted at Chiverley Station, a mere 12 miles up the track. Left on their train across the Blowkrans Bridge. They screamed across the bridge. General Louis Botha's men had blockaded the railway line with rocks, and Churchill looked out of he was in the engine of the cabin of the engine, looked out, and he could see about 100 Boer horsemen and many more in the long grass. He immediately took over command of the Epit and sent the train back. But by this time, Louis Botha had his men blockading the rocks behind them, which they crashed into with a terrible crash, dislocating the last two coaches. Churchill then took charge of the effort, and he got the men to then, while still under fire, to then undo the two coaches. Meanwhile, the Boers were letting them have it with small armed fire, their Maxims and a field gun, and eventually they got themselves free. They then put the wounded soldiers in the engine and in the tender, and the able-bodied ones they had running next to the train, using the train as a shield, and they went back across the bridge. Churchill got hold of Wagner and said, stop. So Wagner was the engine driver. I'm going to show you Wagner. Wagner was the engine driver. He's the one, he was wounded. And he and Churchill escorted them across. They ran through then on the other side of the bridge, on their retreat. Churchill stopped the train, and he said, and here's what he says. He says, stop the train. Go and get help. And then he says, I want to go back. I can't bear to leave those beggars to their fate, which everyone thought was a hell of a brave thing, but bloody stupid. But he walked up, he decides to go, so he himself walks across the train, or across the bridge back again, looking for stragglers. And eventually he sees a whole lot of Boers on horses further down, 100 meters away. And they open fire on him, and he takes cover behind a platelayer's hut. He could feel the bullets sucking the air out around him. And then he crawled up to the top of the clear ground, where he thought he would then take cover under the trees. Unfortunately, when he got there, he found himself looking down the barrel of a Boer gun. Daniel Oosthuizen, field cornet Daniel Oosthuizen, was looking at the other end of the sights with his ice blue eyes, and so he was captured. Then they took him to a tent, Piet Joubert's tent, just a further way away, and at that tent they were having a meeting, and in the tent was Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, and General Joubert were in the tent together. They brought him up there, and they had a long debate. Well, was he claimed that he was a journalist, and how dare they arrest him? But they had seen him take command. They'd seen him take command of that train, and they'd seen him run it back. And some had even seen him with a rifle, with a gun in his hand. And so as far as they were concerned, he was still in the military. And General Louis Botha actually, at some stage, there was a bit of a race around of who actually had caught him, who had arrested Churchill. And Louis Botha had actually claimed that it was him at one stage, and it was actually backed up by Churchill in his book, My Early Years. And, oh, you're supposed to be looking at this picture. And so the story went. But we know that it was Daniel Oosthuizen, who unfortunately was killed in action only 3 months later and couldn't stand around and correct what was going on. And so he was captured and arrested. And they took him to this tent to discuss all of this. Now, can you just imagine? I wonder if they imagined those 3 guys. They were sitting in a tent having captured Churchill. Within 10 years, those same 3 people were sitting in an office in Whitehall, sorting out the conditions under which South Africa, as the Union of South Africa, could be established. I mean, isn't that a wonderful kind of thought? Those sort of things that do happen. Now, Churchill was now, I showed you, he was now paraded, but they were terribly civil in those days. Churchill was taken from Elandslaagte to Pretoria under guard by train. And one of the guards was a guy called H.G. Spaarwater. Now, H.G. Spaarwater, his granddaughter, her name is Martha Bam. Martha Bam has kept a little letter written in pencil, which Churchill gave to him. And it goes like this letter. And you can't read that, so I'm going to read it to you because I've got it typed here, you see. The bearer, H.G. Spaarwater, has been kind to me and the British officers captured on the escort train. I shall be personally grateful to anyone who may be able to offer him any service, should he himself be taken prisoner. Signed, Winston S. Churchill, November the 17th, 1899. Johannesburg was alight with rumor. Some people had heard that he'd escaped. Some people, all sorts of rumors were going around. People believed that it was just talk. But it's amazing how rumors themselves, they made up with talk and idle chatter and all sorts of things, and suddenly they become the truth. And so their first official notice was posted in Pretoria, offering a reward of £25 for Churchill's recapture, dead or alive. And then the details started to filter down. From the time that Churchill was captured, he objected. He objected to being locked up and demanded to be set free. General Joubert was strongly opposed on the grounds that he was dangerous, and he advised Rates. Now, Rates was the Secretary of State. In the absence of Kruger, he was actually the head of the Transvaal government. But they allowed Churchill to write all sorts of things. He wrote to the Prince of Wales, he wrote to senators, he wrote to members of Parliament in England, and the most he wrote to is he wrote to Louis de Souza. He was the governor of the state's model school jail. And that's it. It was a school which they turned into a jail. And he was being held in a prison here. And so he threatened to escape. There was a guy, and there were all sorts of rumors about this place. There was a guy who apparently used to walk his dog and pat in Morse code messages to the prisoners. And there was another one about guys who were throwing spitballs across with little messages from telegrams and so on. They all had messages in and out, and one doesn't really know what had happened or not. But he found himself in a dormitory with Captain Elmire Haldane. That was when he was made Lieutenant Colonel, but I haven't got a picture of that. And I haven't got a picture of Brocky for you. And Brocky, Sergeant Major Brocky, whom Haldane, this guy, lied about, because he told the authorities that Brocky was a lieutenant. And he wanted Brocky in his dormitory. They call it dormitory. In his dormitory was Brocky could speak Dutch and a native language. So Brocky, Haldane, and Churchill found themselves, and this is just to keep you occupied while I talk, found themselves in this prison. And they decided that they really were going to escape. And the jail that they were being held in wasn't going to hold them. So one day, Churchill, and they were hitching a plot. They were hitching a plot that they were going to overpower the guards in the jail, and then they were going to take over, and then they were going to join up with the 2,000 prisoners held at the race course, and they were going to overthrow Pretoria and take charge of it. Then that came to absolutely nothing, but then they had another plan. They had a plan to escape. And their plan worked like this. They had observed that behind, on the fence, there were sentries on the fence, and there was a circular latrine, and there was a spot where, on occasions, they had observed one particular sentry who would wander over and talk to his chum, the next sentry down, on occasions, and would leave at that spot, out of sight. So they decided that they would wait for him, usually when the guys were having supper. So they decided that's what they'll do. They'll wait until he gets to that spot, and they'll jump over, and they'll escape. Now, Churchill believed that he had every right to escape. So they decided to make their escape on the 11th of December, 1899. And Churchill, being very moral and doing the right thing, decided that he should write a letter to De Souza. De Souza was the governor of the jail. And he'd write him a really nice, jolly letter, and here's the letter. I do not consider that your government was justified in holding me, and I have consequently resolved to escape. The arrangement, they had jolly civil, eh? You know, this is before the war got all ugly. The arrangements I have succeeded in making, in conjunction with my friends outside, are such as to give me every confidence. This was so that people left in jail wouldn't be blamed. But I wish, before in leaving, you thus hastily and unceremoniously, to once more place on record my appreciation of the kindness which has been shown me and the other prisoners held by the commandant and by Dr. Gunning, and my admiration for the chivalrous and humane character of the Republican forces. Goes on. My views on the general question of the war remained unchanged, but I shall retain a feeling of high respect for the several burghers I have met. And when I reach the British lines, which should be in March, I will set forth a truthful and impartial account of my experiences in Pretoria. In conclusion, I desire to express my obligation to you and to hope that when this most grievous and unhappy war shall have come to an end, and a state of affairs may be created which shall preserve at once the national pride of the Boers and the security of the British, and put a final stop to the rivalry and enmity of both races, regretting that circumstances have not permitted me to bid you a personal farewell, believe me to be yours very sincerely, Winston S. Churchill. Unfortunately, the guard didn't move that night, so they had to put it off until the next night. He had to run back and go and get his letter, which he'd left on De Souza's pillow. So he got it back, and the next night they decided to go again. Brocky accused, and Haldane decided, no, Brocky accused Haldane of being a coward and being afraid. "Go see for yourself," he said. Haldane retorted. So Brocky walked over. Churchill thought he'd accompany him and walked after him to go and have a look for himself. And once he got there, he peeked around the latrine and noticed that the sentry had walked over and the spot was unsighted. So taking a giant leap and striking while the iron was hot, he clambered over the fence, catching his clothes on the decorative finials, and he fell into the bushes behind on the other side. He lay there and he waited for Haldane and Brocky to join him. And then the owner of the house next door and a guest and their dog came walking around, and the dog decided that he wanted to investigate. But thank goodness a cat just broke free and a dog was after him. So he had to wait more and more for Haldane and Brocky because they had the food, they had the chocolate, they had maps and a compass. So he lay there, sat there. A little later, the dog was just about to complete his investigation and the owner called him in. And Haldane, about an hour and a half later, Haldane came and said, "You'd better go. There's no chance of us doing." So Churchill lay there for quite a while, and then he clambered over the fence, over the neighbour's fence, walked down Skinner Street, dressed in a brown suit and a brown hat given to him by a Hofmeyr, and like every other person in Pretoria, looked like a citizen of Pretoria. And this is the part that everybody asks me about. And he sat on the parapet wall of the Arpies River, which is a slender little streamlet, you know, don't you? And I was told this very evening that he, as he says, it was a raging torrent. Well, I gave this lecture some time back, and I was speaking to a friend, and a friend of mine corrected me, and he said, "You know, he lived in Pretoria, and sometimes that damn river did come down in a torrent. So let's give old Churchill his torrent, and we'll live with our little stream." So, but now he was lucky to be away, but he didn't know which way to go. He had no plan. He had no maps. So he decided that he would go down and find the railway line, which he did. And then he sought out, there was Orion blazing away in the sky, and he headed in that direction. And off he went, and he marched next to the railway line quite a while, always dodging away from the bridges and wherever there was light, because he suspected that the guards were there. And eventually he came to a little station called Kuduspoort. And he positioned himself at the side of the railway line where there was a bend in the track, where the guard and the engine driver couldn't see that spot. And there was also an incline where the train would have to slow down. And he sat and waited, and waited, and waited some more. And then eventually a train did come across, and then he discovered it wasn't such an easy idea. It was only after the 5th try that he managed to fling himself up onto the couplings between the two back trucks, and found himself in a truck filled with empty coal bags. And he snuggled in between these, and he was so pleased to lie there, and he fell asleep thinking about how he was getting away from his captors at 20 miles an hour. So he woke the next morning to find that he was riding into the rising sun. He was going in the right direction because he was heading for Lorenzen Marks. And now I must show you the map. Oh no, I mustn't. No, next one's the map. He was heading towards Lorenzen Marks, but he was approaching Balmoral. And he looked at the Balmoral station, and he could see that there was a lot of activity going on there, so he decided to jump off the train, which he did. And he hurt himself slightly. And he hid in a copse of blue gum trees. Just over there was a native kraal, and he was too scared to approach that. So he hid in these blue gum trees, drinking from a pool. You can only imagine the water quality. He was drinking from a pool and eating sparingly from his chocolate. He lay there all day wondering what to do. Then he decided that he would carry on marching down the track, but he would take off as night fell. And as twilight set in, he was ready to make his move. Was it his imagination, Or was the station much busier than he first thought? Were they looking for him? Trains seemed to have dried up, and he was looking for the same kind of situation that he'd found before, but there was none to find. So he just carried on marching. And eventually, around about midnight, he could see the lights of Woodbank in the distance. But there was a light a little closer, a light coming from a coal mine. And he decided to brazen it out. The turmoil of his emotions, tired, hungry, young Churchill decided to brazen it out and knocked at the door. A door underneath a lighted window from an upper floor. And the head poked out of the window and looked down and said, "Wie ist daar?" And he gave them a long cock and bull story about falling off a train. And the voice said to him, "Wait, come down." And he opened the door. And there was John Howard, a tall Englishman with a droopy moustache and a very menacing revolver. Churchill started telling the story about he fell off, and he said, "Come and sit down. Let me look at your wounds." Had enough of that. And then he gave him a Scotch whiskey and soda from the sideboard. And while Churchill was blabbing on, and he settled him down and he fed him, all the while thinking what to do. Now, because John Howard was the manager of the Transvaal and Delagoa Bay colliery, which was owned by a German with pro-British feeling, but had also a number of British miners that worked for this guy in that mine headgear. And so he summoned them to come and help. And one of them was a guy called Daniel Dewsnap from Oldham in England. And this guy had actually heard Churchill speak, only 5 months earlier than this, heard Churchill speak while he was campaigning for the seat in Oldham in England, which he won. And then when the first streaks of dawn came across the mining yard, they took him down into the tunnels, that only those present were confident enough that they knew where they were and where to go. And they took him down into the tunnels, and they took him to a spot. They took him to a spot where there was a dip in the tunnel, which had filled with water, and had become a black, oily mirror. And they waded through and came up on the other side, and they gave him some candles, a blanket, and a bottle of scotch. What next? They gave him a bottle of scotch and told him, "Don't move, because the morning shift will soon be down." Churchill soon lost his candle and found himself in the velvet darkness, and he fell asleep thinking about his future. Yes, he'll join the army. Yes, I think he'll join the army. And then he went to sleep, and he woke up to a rosy glow. It was Howard with 2 roast chickens, some books, and some cigars, and more canned candles. Churchill said to him, lost his candle. Howard told him that the rats had stolen it. And so Churchill got his food, he got his candle, and he got his cigars, and he was busy smoking away there. And one of the black miners wanted to trace the smell of the cigar, and he brought himself, and there he saw Churchill's foreshortened body between the black mirror of the water and the top of with smoke coming out of his nose, and he ran off shouting, "Tokolos, Tokolos, Tokolos!" You know, that part of the mine wasn't visited for the next 3 years. That night, Howard joined Churchill and took him out for a walk, just really to relieve his nausea, and told him that Churchill had been captured. He'd been captured in Vereeniging, and he was on the train off to Pretoria, so that the heat was off. It was off until they found that they had the wrong fellow. But Howard hadn't been idle. Howard was a Freemason, I might tell you, and he got a Freemason friend of his, one Charles Burnham, to help him. And Charles Burnham was a shopkeeper and a shipping clerk. And Charles was sending off a load of wool to Lorenz and Marks, which was the closest port. And so because they used to load, the mine had its own little branch line. And the trucks would come in, they could load it at their leisure, and they loaded the wool on and built it in like a little cave. And they stuck Churchill in the cave, and Burnham's mother left him with food, and they sent him off, clanking rattle. But Burnham joined the train and went with him so that just in case he got shoved off on a branch line and forgotten about. And it did happen. Poor old, we can't go on too long, but on a number of occasions, old Burnham had to bribe his way through to make sure that particular left and carried on. And finally, they ended up going through, getting back on the train, and they ended up going into Mozambique. They crossed the border at Rosano Garcia. Churchill threw off the tarpaulin and sang and shouted and shot his revolver with pure joy. They finally reached Lorenzo Marx, and there were a few hitches. That's just what I say here. But there were a hell of a lot of hitches. They put them in the police station for goodness knows how long, questioning him. Finally, he got off to the Consul General, and the Consul General sent off a telegram. They had to bribe him because we didn't want to let any secrets out. They sent a telegram off to Howard to say that the goods had arrived. And Churchill wrote a letter to the editor of the Standard and Diggers News of Johannesburg. Churchill wrote that he would be happy to give the details of his escape the next time he's in Pretoria, which he thought would be March. There we go. And he then found himself on a coastal ship, a little coaster called Induna. And they sailed off, and they eventually ended up in the Durban harbour. He arrived in Durban on Saturday, the 23rd of December, 1899. The harbour was crowded. The ships were laying and the only way he could park the Induna was triple parking, like they do in Cape Town. Triple parking down to get to the Induna. And so he arrived in there, and there was a crowd there. 20 ships were riding at anchor. More troop ships were circling the bay. The skipper of the Induna found a triple parking. The Mercury printed this heading of their newsline: Winston Churchill escapes, arrives here today. It had been a black Friday for the British troops, a black week. The British forces had suffered 3 disastrous defeats with enormous losses at Stormberg, at Machersfontein, and just recently, a few days before, at Colenso. The popular hero, General Buller, was replaced by Lord Kitchener, first Roberts, and then Kitchener joined him. You can see the pictures of the crowd at the harbour. British supporters needed the morale, and the Durban population, which was nearly double its normal size, rushed to the docks. Churchill later described it like this: I reached Durban to find myself. Oh, I forgot a very important point. When they got to Lorenz and Marx, they took him off to go and see the Consul General, and they bought him a new suit of clothes and a cowboy hat. And the cowboy hat, I'm going to show you him with his cowboy hat. Bought him with a cowboy hat. So cowboy hat and all, he got himself on the Induna, and then they went down to Durban, and you can see how crowded that was. And now, this is how he writes about Durban. I reached Durban to find myself a popular hero. I was received as if I had won a great victory. The harbour was decorated with flags and bands, and crowds thronged the quays. The Admiral and the General and the Mayor pressed on board and grasped my hand. I was nearly torn to pieces by enthusiastic kindness. I was whirled along on the shoulders of the crowd. I was carried to the steps of the town hall, where nothing would content them but a speech, which, after a little reluctance, I was induced to deliver. And there's this plaque on that's him, and this is the plaque at our city hall in Durban. And in a measured, deliberate, stentorian style that the whole world would recognize instantly in years to come, he roused their spirits with this speech. We are in the midst of a fierce battle with a vast military power which has grown up in the heart of this country, which is resolved at all costs to gratify its reckless ambition by beating the British out of this country. Never, 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 they shouted, never, never, never. Churchill carried on. When I see around me a crowd such as this, with such determination and such enthusiasm, I am satisfied that no matter what the difficulties, no matter what the dangers, and what force they may bring, that we shall be successful in the end. You will see in this country the beginning of a new era when peace, prosperity shall reign, so that the Cape may be, in fact, as well as in word, a Cape of good hope. Churchill's words were reported in the press with reverence, as if he was a commanding officer, commander-in-chief. Ogden cigarettes, they used to always have cigarette cards. They had a set for the important generals, and they put Churchill in one of the cigarette cards. But he didn't forget those who helped him and who left him behind. Where as soon as he got back to England, he ordered 8 gold watches and engraved with their names and the words, "From Winston Churchill, in recognition of timely help afforded him in his escape from Pretoria during the South African War, December the 13th, 1899. His granddaughter Celia Sands has traced 5 of those watches, and one of them, she's traced that too, but it was destroyed in a fire. Churchill wasted no time. He took himself off on a train, off to Pietermaritzburg, where he met the Prime Minister, Sir Walter Healy Hutchinson, the Governor, and the Prime Minister, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Albert Heim. But he didn't stay there long either. He trailed himself immediately off to Frere. And like all good stories, it ends where it started. He walked up the track, and he came across his bell tent. It was still there. I don't know where Thomas Walden, his valet, was, but the tent was there. He walked across the bridge, and in one of his books, he says that he actually slept in the plate layer's hut, where the bullets sucked the air out around him. And we don't know where he spent Christmas, but we know that it was within yards of where he was captured. Thank you.
And hello, look, very good. The thing is, what happened then?
What happened then? Yes, he didn't see the war through to the end per se here, but there's another whole story. We've got another one to come after that, haven't we? Another whole chapter.
Are you coming back?
Next year, the same time, because my grandson, my son, and my daughter-in-law each have a birthday this week. So next year, this week, I'll be back.
The watches that were presented to those who actually assisted. You say you've come in 5. Where are they? Are they still in the country, or?
No, they were sent to all sorts of people who'd gone back to England, people, Burnham, I think one or two of them are in the country, but most of them were ended up back in England. One of them in a fire and they couldn't find. Well, there's remnants.
Quite a lot at the beginning that he was going up to Ladysmith.
Well, you know, this is another whole thing. I've got a theory about this. Paul Kruger, there was a moratorium that the Brits must get their soldiers off his border, turn the ships back and stop this army thing. And he gave them a moratorium of a date, which they ignored. So he did something which I think is maybe a bit of a crazy thing. He actually left the Transvaal and he besieged Ladysmith. And he besieged Kimberley. Why? And now I'll tell you my theory. No, but that's where that was the interface of the Boer War at that stage. I think why is because all those ships that you saw down there were all running on coal. And if you stop the coal mines, Newcastle, Ladysmith, all of those, it's like closing all the service stations from here to Johannesburg. And that's my theory. Might be total rubbish, but but he did a funny thing. They didn't correspond to his moratorium, so he left the Transvaal to attack, which maybe not clever.
Sorry, sir, not a question, just a comment. I had grandfathers who fought on both sides of that war, because my mother was an Afrikaner and her father was a rapportrijer in the war, and my grandfather came from Cornwall to mine gold in the Transvaal, was press gate into the British Army. And so my two grandfathers fought on opposite sides of the St. Bird.
Well, I'm not going to trump your ace, but my grandfather was one of the guys held up in Kimberley, besieged at Kimberley. And he was from East London, and he taught, when they were running out of ammunition, he taught the British soldiers, he was with Baden-Powell in Kimberley, he taught the British soldiers how to make bombs in condensed milk tins and cast them with a fishing rod. And Baden-Powell actually drew a picture of my grandfather doing this. So after the war, my grandfather went and retired in East London, and Baden-Powell came to East London and wanted to find him, but thank God he died, because he changed sides like your family. He changed sides when he got back to East London, and he joined the British Army. So there we go. I mean the Boer Army, South African Army.
Thank you very much. We've most entertaining. Do you have any information about his escapades at our local Nelly's, the Mount Nelson Hotel?
No, I don't, but that sounds fun. I must go and look that up. There's a rumor that Louis Botha's daughter, Helen, accompanied him on all of his trips as his sort of hostess. And apparently, Churchill and Helen had a date or two. So, who knows? Life's fun, eh?
We have made a donation to the African Scholars Fund on your behalf, and we also offering you a free membership of U3A for 1 whole year. But it sounds like we're going to have you back this time next year, because you've got all those birthdays.
Yep.
And in the introduction, I heard that you have been an actor, and today we saw you acting sober and taking on the voice and the personality of Churchill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.